It all started so innocently. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, teetering on the edge of betrayal. I was married to Tom for 7 years. 7 years of comfort, laughter, and understanding. Our life together felt stable, predictable, and safe. But maybe that was the problem. Safe started to feel suffocating. Tom was a wonderful husband, don't get me wrong. He was reliable and caring. But as time went on, our conversations became more about logistics, what to have for dinner, paying bills, and who would take care of our dog, Max. The spark that once burned brightly had slowly dimmed, but I thought that was just a part of marriage. Everyone gets to this stage, right? That's when he came into the picture. It was a chilly Thursday evening in late fall. The leaves had just started to blanket the streets in rich shades of orange and gold, and I remember wrapping my scarf around myself a little tighter as I walked to the event. Tom couldn't make it, work as usual, but my best friend Rachel had an extra ticket to this celebrity gala. I didn't even know who would be there, but the thought of dressing up and getting a night away from the mundane was too tempting to pass up. The event was glamorous, filled with people I recognized from TV shows, magazines, and movies. The whole room buzzed with energy, laughter, and clinking glasses. I felt like an outsider looking in, but it was a thrill just to be there. Rachel and I sipped champagne, watching as some of Hollywood's biggest names brushed past us, looking impossibly perfect. Then he walked in. Dylan Hart, the actor everyone was talking about. He had just landed a major role in one of the biggest blockbuster franchises of the year, and his name was on everyone's lips. Tall, with piercing blue eyes and dark hair that fell just slightly over his forehead, he carried himself with the kind of confidence only someone used to the spotlight could have. I'd seen his movies, of course, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. There was an aura about him, an electricity that seemed to fill the room. To my surprise, Rachel, always the social butterfly, knew someone who knew him. Before I could even process what was happening, we were being introduced. I smiled nervously as Dylan's eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, I felt like the only person in the room. He was charismatic, charming, and his smile, oh that smile, was disarming in a way that made my heart race in a way it hadn't in years. We exchanged pleasantries, just small talk at first. I mentioned how I admired his work, how I'd been a fan for a while, and he seemed genuinely interested in me, not as a fan but as a person. He asked about my life, what I did for work, what brought me to the event. His attention was intoxicating, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation, completely oblivious to the rest of the party swirling around us. Rachel eventually got pulled away by someone she knew, and it was just me and Dylan. Alone. I could feel the tension between us growing, subtle but unmistakable. The way his eyes lingered on mine, the way his arm brushed against my waist as he leaned in closer to hear me over the music, it was electric. I knew I should have walked away. I had a husband waiting for me at home, but the pull was undeniable. We spent the rest of the night talking, laughing, sharing stories. I told him about Tom, about my marriage, but in a way that felt more distant than it should have. Dylan didn't pry, but he listened, really listened. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. As the evening wound down, I could feel something shifting. There was a moment, one of those pivotal moments where you know deep down that what happens next will change everything. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Do you want to get out of here?" I should have said no. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to pull back, to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself nodding, breathless with anticipation. We slipped out of the party unnoticed, weaving through the darkened streets of the city. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with a mix of excitement and guilt. Dylan led me to a quiet rooftop bar. One of those hidden gems where the view was spectacular, and no one cared who you were. It felt like we had escaped into our own little world, away from prying eyes and the life I was supposed to return to. We ordered drinks but barely touched them. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer light and casual. There was something simmering between us, a tension that was almost palpable. I knew what was happening and I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to. When he kissed me, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. It wasn't just the physical act, it was the passion behind it, the connection. I felt alive, as if I had been asleep for years and was only just waking up. My hands instinctively found their way to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat under my fingers. His touch was gentle yet commanding, and I melted into him. every rational thought slipping away. I didn't think about Tom or our life or the consequences of what I was doing. All I could think about was the moment, the way Dylan made me feel, the thrill of it all. We spent the rest of the night wrapped up in each other. The world outside fading into nothing. It was exhilarating, dangerous, and completely intoxicating. But as the sun began to rise, reality came crashing back. I slipped out of Dylan's arms, my heart heavy with the weight of what I'd done. I knew I couldn't stay. I had a husband waiting for me at home. And so I left, my mind spinning, unsure of what this all meant for me, for my marriage, for everything. The cab ride home was a blur. I could barely focus on the lights passing by, the hum of the city lulling me into a strange state of numbness. My phone buzzed in my purse. Tom. A simple text. Miss you. Can't wait to see you when you get home. I stared at the message, guilt washing over me in waves. How did I let this happen? I wasn't the type to cheat. Or at least I never thought I was. But Dylan, he was a force, something bigger than myself. And in that moment, under the dim lights of that rooftop, I wasn't thinking about right or wrong. I was thinking about how he made me feel. By the time I unlocked the door to our apartment, the sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the floor. Tom was still asleep, his deep breaths coming in slow, steady rhythms. I watched him for a moment, my heart heavy with a mixture of regret and confusion. I didn't know what to do with these feelings. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I wondered how long I could keep this secret. Could I really just bury it, pretend it never happened? Or would it eat away at me until there was nothing left of our marriage? The next few days were a whirlwind of normalcy. Tom and I settled back into our routine: work, dinner, TV, and bed. But everything felt different. Every time he touched me, kissed me, or asked how my day was, I felt like a fraud. I'd betrayed him in the worst way, and the weight of it was suffocating. But I didn't stop thinking about Dylan. It was like he had taken up permanent residence in my mind, a lingering presence that I couldn't shake. I replayed that night over and over, the intensity of our connection, the way his touch had set my skin on fire. I knew I should let it go, push it aside, but the truth was, I didn't want to. About a week later, I got a message from him. Dylan, hey. Thinking about you. Want to meet up? My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the message and moved on with my life. But my fingers had a mind of their own. Me where? We met at a small tucked-away cafe in a part of town where no one would recognize us. As soon as I walked in and saw him sitting there, his eyes locked on mine, I felt that familiar pull. It was like gravity drawing me toward him in a way I couldn't resist. Dylan smiled as I approached, standing up to greet me. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he said softly, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for something. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, sitting down across from him. My hands trembled slightly, and I clasped them together in my lap to steady myself. This shouldn't be happening. His gaze softened. I know. But we both know it's not that simple. And it wasn't. Being with Dylan was like standing on the edge of a cliff. It was dangerous, thrilling, and absolutely reckless. But at the same time, it was the most alive I had felt in years. We spent the next hour talking, but there was an unspoken tension between us, hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. We didn't touch, didn't cross any lines, but the way he looked at me, God, it was intoxicating. I knew I wasn't strong enough to walk away, not yet. By the time we parted ways, he left me with a promise. Let me know when you're ready. For anything. I didn't know what anything meant, but I knew I wasn't ready to let him go. The affair, if I can even call it that at this point, became a secret I clung to like a lifeline. It was my escape, my way of feeling something more than the routine I had fallen into with Tom. Don't get me wrong, I still love Tom, I think. But it was a different kind of love now, more like comfort than passion. And Dylan was everything that passion had once been. We met in secret, stolen moments between his demanding schedule and my own carefully constructed life. I became an expert in lies, small ones at first, an extra meeting at work, drinks with friends. But soon the lies grew bigger. A weekend away with Rachel that didn't actually include Rachel at all. A late work conference that was really just a rendezvous with Dylan in a city far from home. Each time we met, it became harder to go back to my real life. Dylan made me feel like I was the only woman in the world, and I craved that feeling more than I cared to admit. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, it was like he could see right through all my walls. He made me feel wanted, desired, like I was something special. With him, I wasn't just Tom's wife or a woman stuck in the same daily routine. I was me, fully alive and fully seen. But nothing stays hidden forever. Secrets have a way of creeping into the cracks of your life, slowly unraveling everything you've built. It was a Friday night, about 3 months into my affair with Dylan. I had just returned home from yet another work trip, my heart still racing from the hours I had spent wrapped in his arms. Tom greeted me at the door with a smile, his eyes tired but warm. He kissed me softly, and I felt that familiar pang of guilt, sharper now than it had ever been. "How was the conference?" he asked as he led me into the kitchen where he had already set the table for dinner. "Good," I lied, my voice steady even though my heart felt like it was pounding in my throat. "Exhausting though." We sat down to eat, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Tom talked about his week, about work, about plans for the weekend. But I was barely listening, my mind still tangled in the memory of Dylan's touch. Then Tom said something that made my heart stop. "You seemed pretty busy on your conference call earlier," he said casually, not even looking up from his plate. I froze. "What do you mean?" He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Your phone, it was buzzing all night. Didn't think work would be texting you so late." Panic shot through me, cold and paralyzing. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I fumbled for an answer. "Oh, that. Yeah, just some last-minute details. It wasn't a big deal." Tom didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at me in that unnerving way that made it feel like he could see right through my lies. Finally, he sighed and pushed his plate away. "I know something's going on, Claire." My heart dropped into my stomach. Tom's words hung in the air, sharp and cold. I felt a surge of panic, my hands tightening around the edge of the table. My mind raced for an explanation, a way to smooth over the growing tension that now felt like a thick wall between us. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady, though my heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to smile, but it felt forced, brittle. "Nothing's going on, Tom. I don't know what you're—" "Don't," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Just don't, Claire." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. The mask I had been wearing, the carefully constructed facade of normalcy, was starting to crack, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. Tom's eyes were dark, searching mine for the truth I wasn't ready to give. "You've been different. Distant," he continued, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself. "For months now. You're always at work late or away on these trips. And even when you're here, you're not here." I felt the weight of his words sinking in, the reality of what I had been doing pressing down on me. I had been so wrapped up in Dylan, so caught up in the thrill of the affair, that I hadn't even noticed how much I had distanced myself from Tom, how much I had neglected him, neglected us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Was it for pulling away from him, or for the lie I was still trying to protect? Tom shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. "I don't need you to be sorry, Claire. I just need you to tell me the truth." His voice cracked slightly, and it hit me just how much this was hurting him. "Is there someone else?" The question hung between us, heavy and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at him, torn between the need to come clean and the overwhelming fear of what would happen if I did. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the weight of my lies pressing down from every side. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, and in that silence Tom's expression shifted, from frustration to something deeper, something more resigned. "Claire," he said softly, almost pleading now, "please, just tell me the truth." My chest tightened, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to let it all out, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But the truth was so ugly, so tangled that I didn't know where to begin. And part of me wasn't ready to let go of what I had with Dylan. As wrong as it was, that part of me still craved the escape, the excitement, the way Dylan made me feel like a different version of myself. But Tom deserved better than this. He deserved the truth. "There is." I began, my voice trembling. "There is someone." Tom's face fell, and for a moment, he looked like I had just ripped the ground out from under him. He ran a hand over his face, his jaw clenched tightly as he absorbed what I had just said. "How long?" he asked quietly, his eyes locked on mine. 3 months. I admitted, my heart aching with every word. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't plan for any of this. 3 months, he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've been lying to me for 3 months. I didn't want to hurt you," I said quickly, the words spilling out in a desperate attempt to explain, to make him understand. "I never wanted any of this, Tom. It just happened." He let out a bitter laugh, his eyes hardening. "Things like this don't just happen, Claire. You don't just accidentally fall into bed with someone." I flinched at his words, the harsh truth of them cutting through me like a blade. He was right. I had made choices, deliberate choices, and now I was facing the consequences of those choices. "Who is he?" Tom asked suddenly, his voice sharp. "Who is this guy that you're willing to throw away our marriage for?" I hesitated, the name on the tip of my tongue but unable to say it. Telling Tom it was Dylan Hart, the Dylan Hart, felt like another betrayal, a final twist of the knife. I couldn't bring myself to say it. "It doesn't matter," I said instead, my voice weak. He's not important." Tom stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Not important? You've been with him for 3 months, and now you're telling me he's not important? Are you kidding me?" I jumped at the sound of his voice, feeling the situation spiraling further out of control. I had broken something between us, something that I wasn't sure could ever be fixed. Tom's hands were shaking as he ran them through his hair, pacing back and forth in the small kitchen. "I thought we were happy," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought we had a good life. What happened, Claire? Where did we go wrong?" I didn't have an answer. How could I explain the restlessness I had felt, the way the routine of our life had started to feel like a cage? How could I tell him that I had started to crave something different, something dangerous, even though I knew it was wrong? "I don't know," I whispered, tears slipping down my cheeks. "I don't know, Tom." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes full of pain and confusion. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Did I love Dylan? Or was it just the idea of him, the excitement, the escape, the way he made me feel like someone else? I didn't know anymore. Everything felt so twisted, so confused. I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom let out a long, shaky breath, and I could see the defeat in his eyes. "I need some time," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I need to think." Before I could say anything, he grabbed his coat and keys, heading for the door. "I'm going to stay with my brother for a while." "Tom, wait," I called after him, but the door was already closing behind him, the sound of it echoing through the empty apartment. And just like that, he was gone. The days after Tom left were some of the hardest of my life. The silence in the apartment was deafening, a constant reminder of the damage I had done. I tried to call him, but he wouldn't pick up. I sent messages apologizing, begging him to talk to me, but there was nothing. No response. I wasn't sure if he would ever come back. And maybe deep down I didn't deserve for him to. Rachel came over one evening, after hearing about what had happened from a mutual friend. She didn't know the whole story, just that Tom and I were having issues. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, not yet. I wasn't ready to admit to anyone else what I had done. "You'll get through this," she said, rubbing my back as I cried into my hands. "You and Tom have been through worse, right? He just needs time." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I believed her. Things felt different this time, like something between Tom and me had been irrevocably shattered. And the worst part was, I knew I was the one who had broken it. A week later, I got another message from Dylan. "Dylan, I miss you. Can we meet?" I stared at the screen, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to see him, to feel that rush again, to escape from the mess I had made of my life. But another part of me, the part that was still clinging to the hope of fixing things with Tom, knew that seeing Dylan again would only make everything worse. "Me, I can't. Not now. Dylan. You know where to find me if you change your mind." I didn't respond. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. As much as I had been drawn to Dylan, I couldn't keep living in this fantasy. I had to face the reality of what I had done, and I had to deal with the consequences of my choices. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. The following weeks felt like a blur. A strange limbo where everything in my life seemed to hang by a thread. Tom was still staying with his brother, and the apartment felt emptier than ever. I'd wake up expecting to see him there, only to be greeted by silence. Every part of our life that used to feel so solid now seemed fragile and uncertain. I couldn't shake the guilt, the overwhelming weight of my betrayal. I thought about Dylan often, too often. Sometimes it was late at night when the loneliness set in and I felt the pull to text him, to seek out that feeling of excitement again. Other times I'd find myself wondering if he was thinking about me too, or if I had just been another passing fling in his world of fast-paced fame. But I fought those thoughts. I knew that reaching out to him again would only drag me further away from what I was trying to save, and I wasn't sure how much more damage I could take. Tom and I hadn't spoken since that night. Every attempt I made to reach out was met with silence. I didn't blame him. If the roles had been reversed, I wasn't sure I'd want to talk either. But the waiting, the not knowing if he would ever come back, was agonizing. A month passed before I finally saw Tom again. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop, pretending to work when I heard the familiar sound of keys in the door. My heart leaped in my chest, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. But then the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, looking more tired and worn than I had ever seen him. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Hey," I whispered, standing up slowly, unsure of what to do or say. My stomach twisted with nerves as I took in the sight of him, my husband, the man I had hurt, standing there in our home after what felt like a lifetime apart. He didn't move from the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if he was seeing it for the first time in weeks. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I came to get some of my things." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened and I felt panic rising in my throat. You're leaving?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked past me and into the bedroom, where he started gathering clothes from the closet, throwing them haphazardly into a suitcase. I followed him, my heart racing. "Tom, wait," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Can we just talk? Please." He paused, his back still turned to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the clothes in his hands like he was trying to keep himself from falling apart. "There's nothing to talk about," he said finally, his voice flat. "You made your choice, Claire." His words stung, sharp and cold. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that I hadn't chosen Dylan over him. But the truth was, in some ways I had. I had chosen to betray Tom, to keep seeing Dylan even when I knew it was wrong. And now I was paying the price. "I made a mistake," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "A huge, horrible mistake. But I don't want to lose you, Tom. I still love you." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Love? You call this love, Claire?" I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, trying to stay composed. "I know I've hurt you, and I know you probably hate me right now. But can we please just try to fix this? We've been through so much together. I don't want to throw it all away." Tom finally turned to face me, his eyes red and tired. He looked at me for a long time and I could see the conflict in his expression, the anger, the hurt, but also something else. Something softer. He didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, and when he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost resigned. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he said, the pain in his voice cutting through me like a knife. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way." His words shattered me. I had known deep down that this was a possibility, that my betrayal had irreparably damaged the foundation of our marriage. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the finality in his tone, made it all too real. "I'll do anything," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I'll go to counseling, I'll give you space, whatever you need. Just don't leave. Please." Tom stared at me, his expression unreadable. He looked like he was wrestling with something inside himself, something that he wasn't sure how to express. Finally, he sighed and closed the suitcase, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I don't know if I'm ready to leave," he said quietly, his eyes downcast. "But I don't know if I'm ready to stay either." I stood there frozen, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to rush to him, to hold him, to promise that I would make everything right. But another part of me knew that this wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple apology. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. And I wasn't sure if we had the strength to do it. Can we just take it one day at a time? I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Can we try? Tom didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, his hands resting on his knees, and for a moment I thought he was going to say no, that he was going to walk out of our apartment and out of my life for good. But then he nodded, slowly, almost reluctantly. One day at a time, he repeated, his voice quiet and tired. That's all I can promise right now. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it was something. It was a sliver of hope, however fragile it might be. The days that followed were tense, awkward, and full of unspoken tension. Tom stayed, but there was a distance between us that I didn't know how to bridge. We slept in the same bed. But there was a gulf between us that felt insurmountable. He barely looked at me, barely spoke to me, and every time I tried to reach out, he pulled away. It was like living with a stranger. I started seeing a therapist, hoping it would help me sort through my own guilt. The days without Tom dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I tried to throw myself into work, to distract myself from the suffocating silence of the apartment, but nothing could pull my thoughts away from him. I kept waiting for a sign, for a call or a text, something that would let me know he was willing to talk, to try and fix what I had shattered. But Tom's absence felt like a finality, like he had already made his decision to leave, and that thought kept me up at night. The apartment was filled with reminders of him. His shoes by the door, his favorite coffee mug on the kitchen counter, the jacket he always wore draped over the back of the chair. I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it, as if moving even one of his things would make it real, would make the possibility of him never coming back undeniable. I spent hours replaying our last conversation. The hurt in his voice when he asked if I loved Dylan. That was the question I kept coming back to. I didn't know if I loved Dylan, but the truth was I didn't even know if I still loved Tom. What I had felt for Dylan was something completely different. Something wild and exhilarating. But was it real? Or had it been nothing more than an escape from the life I felt trapped in? The guilt weighed on me every moment of the day. I hated myself for hurting Tom, for betraying the man who had stood by me for years, the man who had always been there, steady and dependable. But I also resented him in some twisted way. I resented the life we had built, the routine that had suffocated me to the point where I sought comfort in someone else. I didn't know how to reconcile these feelings, how to make sense of the fact that I was both heartbroken and relieved that Tom was gone. About 2 weeks after Tom had left, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second I thought it might be Tom, that he had finally come back to talk. But when I opened the door, it wasn't him. It was Dylan. He stood there, hands shoved in the pockets of his jacket, looking every bit as confident and handsome as ever. But there was something softer in his expression, something almost vulnerable. "I've been thinking about you," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. I stood there, unsure of what to say. Seeing him brought back a flood of emotions, both good and bad. Part of me wanted to fall into his arms, to let him take me away from the mess I had made of my life. But the other part of me, the part that had been slowly waking up to the reality of my situation, knew that seeing him was only going to make things more complicated. "Dylan, you shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I glanced behind me, as if expecting Tom to walk through the door any second, even though I knew he wouldn't. Dylan stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, just like it always had. But this time it didn't feel right. It felt wrong, like a reminder of the mistakes I had made. "I know things are complicated," he said softly, "but I miss you, Claire. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And I know you feel the same." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I did miss him, there was no denying that. But missing him didn't mean I could keep doing this, living this double life, torn between two men and two completely different versions of myself. "I don't know what I feel anymore," I admitted, opening my eyes to meet his. "I don't even know who I am right now." Dylan's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his hands cupping my face. "You're the woman I fell for," he whispered, his lips dangerously close to mine. You're the woman who deserves more than a life that makes her feel trapped. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. There was a time when I would have melted at those words, when I would have let him sweep me off my feet and carry me away from the mess of my life. But now, standing here with him, I realized something. I couldn't keep running away from my problems. Dylan was an escape, but he wasn't a solution. He wasn't going to fix the mess I had made of my marriage. Only I could do that. Dylan, I can't, I whispered, stepping back from him. His hands fell to his sides, and I saw a flash of confusion, then hurt, cross his face. What do you mean? He asked, his voice soft but tense. I can't do this anymore, I said, shaking my head. I can't keep running away from everything. I need to face what I've done. I need to try and make things right with Tom. Dylan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue to try and convince me to stay. But instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes dark with disappointment. If that's what you want, he said quietly, his voice laced with sadness. It's not about what I want, I replied, my voice trembling. It's about what I need to do. I'm sorry, Dylan. For everything. He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to find the right words to say. But in the end, he just nodded again and turned to leave. And just like that, Dylan was gone. After Dylan left, I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where he had stood just moments ago. I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness, like I had just closed the door on something that had once made me feel so alive. But at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't sure what was going to happen with Tom, or if we would ever be able to repair the damage I had caused. But I knew I had to try. I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between two lives, two men. I had to make a choice, and I had made it. It took another few days before Tom finally called. My heart jumped when I saw his name flash on the screen, a mix of hope and dread swirling in my chest. Hey, I said quietly, my voice shaky. Hey, he replied, his tone guarded but not cold. Can we talk? Yes, I said quickly. Of course. We agreed to meet at a small park near our apartment, a place we used to go to on weekends when things were simpler. The walk there felt like the longest of my life, my heart pounding in anticipation of what Tom might say, of what might happen next. When I saw him sitting on a bench staring out at the pond, I hesitated for a moment before approaching him. He looked up as I sat down beside him, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words, until finally Tom spoke. I don't know where we go from here, he said quietly, his eyes still focused on the water. But I need to know, are you done with him? Yes, I whispered, my voice firm even though my heart was still heavy with guilt. It's over, Tom. I ended it. He nodded slowly, his jaw tight as if he was holding back a flood of emotions. Why, Claire? He asked after a moment, turning to look at me. Why did you do it? The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain the restlessness, the boredom, the way I had felt like I was slowly losing myself in the monotony of our life? How could I tell him that I had sought something else, something exciting and dangerous, because I was too scared to confront the cracks in our marriage? I don't know, I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. I wish I had an answer, Tom. I wish I could tell you it was just a mistake or that it didn't mean anything, but that wouldn't be fair. I was lost, I was unhappy, and I didn't know how to fix it, so I ran away instead. And I'm so sorry. Tom was silent for a long time, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. But there was something else there too. Something softer, a glimmer of the man who had once loved me so deeply. I don't know if we can fix this, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I think I want to try. My heart skipped a beat, hope flickering to life in my chest. I want to try too, I whispered, reaching for his hand. He hesitated for a moment, but then slowly he took my hand in his. The warmth of his touch was comforting, familiar, and for the first time in months, I felt a small sense of peace. Rebuilding our marriage was not going to be easy. There were days when Tom would barely speak to me, the weight of my betrayal still hanging between us like an invisible wall. And there were days when I questioned whether we could really get past this, whether I had done too much damage to ever truly heal. But we were trying. For the first time in a long time, we were both trying. We started going to therapy, something I had never thought we'd need. But it helped. It gave us a space to talk about everything, about the affair, about the cracks in our marriage, about the things we had both been ignoring for so long. There were moments in those sessions that were brutally painful moments where I had to confront the full extent of what I had done. But there were also moments of hope, moments where I could see the path forward, even if it was still shrouded in uncertainty. Slowly, Tom and I began to rebuild our life together. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the hurt was too raw, when the distance between us felt too great to bridge. But we were moving forward one step at a time. The first few weeks of trying to rebuild our marriage felt like we were walking on fragile ground. Every conversation, every touch, every glance was filled with unspoken tension. It was as if we were both waiting for the other shoe to drop, for one of us to break under the weight of everything we had been through. But despite the tension, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. Our therapy sessions were a lifeline. It was there, in the safety of that room with our therapist, that Tom and I began to confront the deeper issues in our marriage, the things that had led us to this breaking point. We didn't just talk about the affair, though we certainly had to face that painful reality, but we also talked about the ways we had both let the relationship slip, how the connection between us had slowly eroded over the years. I didn't realize how distant you had become until it was too late, Tom admitted one evening during a particularly emotional session. His voice was heavy with regret, and his eyes were fixed on the floor. I should have noticed. I should have tried harder. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that the affair had been my choice, my mistake. But the truth was, he wasn't entirely wrong. We had both stopped trying. Somewhere along the way we had become so comfortable with each other, so used to the routine, that we stopped putting in the effort that a marriage requires. And while that didn't excuse what I had done, it was part of the reason why it had happened. I didn't know how to tell you that I was unhappy. I confessed, my voice trembling. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself. I felt like I was losing myself in our life. Everything became so predictable, so routine, and I didn't know how to get that spark back. So instead of talking to you about it, I ran away from it. Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything right away. I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that my words had caused, but there was also a softness there, a willingness to listen, to try and understand. We both ran away, he said after a long pause. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. I wasn't there for you like I should have been. I thought everything was fine because we weren't fighting, because we were going through the motions. But I wasn't really paying attention. It was hard to hear, but it was also the truth. We had both been on autopilot, drifting through our marriage without really being present. And that was how the cracks had started to form, how the distance between us had grown. The road to rebuilding our trust was slow and painful. Tom struggled with the betrayal, and I couldn't blame him for that. Some days he would be fine, warm, affectionate, as if things were slowly going back to normal. But other days I could see the doubt in his eyes, the questions he wasn't asking but that hung in the air between us. "Are you sure it's over with him?" he asked one evening as we sat on the couch, the TV playing in the background, though neither of us was really watching. His voice was quiet, but the question carried the weight of everything we had been through. "It's over," I assured him, my voice steady. "I haven't spoken to him since I ended it. I don't want to go back to that life, Tom. I want to fix this. I want us." Tom nodded, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was going to take time. I knew that. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and I had shattered his in the worst possible way. I couldn't expect him to just forgive and forget. But it was still hard to see him struggle, to know that my actions had caused this rift between us. A few months passed, and slowly the wounds began to heal. It wasn't a smooth process. There were setbacks, moments of doubt and frustration, but we were making progress. We started spending more time together, going on date nights like we used to in the early days of our relationship. It felt strange at first, almost like we were trying to get to know each other all over again. But in a way, that's exactly what we were doing. One night, we went to a small Italian restaurant that we used to frequent when we first started dating. It was a cozy, intimate place with candlelit tables and soft music playing in the background. As we sat across from each other, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about nothing in particular, I felt a flicker of that old connection between us, the one that had once been so strong, so unbreakable. "I've missed this," Tom said, his voice soft as he reached across the table to take my hand. "I've missed us." I squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch. "Me too," I whispered, my heart swelling with a mixture of hope and guilt. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time I felt like we had a chance, a real chance at making it work. But even as things were getting better with Tom, I couldn't escape the lingering shadow of Dylan. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he showed up at my apartment, but his presence still haunted me, like an unresolved chapter in my life. I didn't love him, not in the way I had once thought, but there was a part of me that still wondered what might have happened if things had been different. If I hadn't been married. If I hadn't already had a life with Tom. One day, about 6 months after I had ended things with Dylan, I got a message from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Dylan. I know it's been a while, but I just wanted to see how you're doing." My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the message, the memories of our time together rushing back in a flood of emotions. I knew I shouldn't respond. I had made my choice and I was trying to move forward with Tom. But seeing Dylan's name again stirred something in me. Something I had thought I had buried for good. I sat there for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, torn between the life I was trying to rebuild and the ghost of the life I had once thought I wanted with Dylan. After what felt like hours, I finally made my decision. "I'm doing okay. But I can't talk to you anymore, Dylan. I need to move on, and so do you." I hit send, my heart racing, and then immediately deleted the conversation. It was time to close that chapter for good. The moment I deleted Dylan's message, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had finally let go of the last remnants of that part of my life. It was over, really truly over. And I was ready to focus on the future, on rebuilding my marriage and finding a way to forgive myself for everything I had done. But forgiveness was not an easy thing to come by. For months I had been carrying the weight of my guilt, and while Tom and I were making progress, I knew that I couldn't fully move forward until I found a way to forgive myself. I had hurt the man I loved, and that was something I couldn't change. But what I could do was try to make things right. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Tom and I sat on the couch in silence. The room was dimly lit, and the soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across the walls. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken words that had been lingering since we left the therapist's office. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did it," Tom said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I want to try. I want to try to forgive you." His words hit me like a wave, and tears immediately filled my eyes. I had been waiting to hear those words for so long, but now that they were here, I wasn't sure how to respond. "Tom, I started, but my voice cracked, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve it." Tom looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something softer, something like hope. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," he said, his voice steady. "But I love you, Claire. And I want to try. I think we both deserve that chance." I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I love you too, Tom. More than anything." He pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We still had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time I truly believed that we could make it. Months passed, and slowly, Tom and I began to rebuild our life together. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the hurt resurfaced, but we were learning how to communicate again, how to be vulnerable with each other in a way we hadn't been for a long time. We took things one day at a time, focusing on the small victories. A shared laugh over dinner. A quiet evening spent watching a movie. A lingering kiss before bed. Each moment felt like a step toward healing. A step toward rediscovering the love that had once been the foundation of our marriage. But perhaps the biggest victory came one sunny afternoon when Tom turned to me. His expression soft but serious. "I forgive you, Claire," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm not saying I'll forget what happened, but I forgive you. And I'm ready to move forward." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, unable to find the words to express the relief and gratitude I felt in that moment. It wasn't just about Tom forgiving me. It was about both of us choosing to let go of the past and focus on the future we still had ahead of us. And so we began a new chapter. One filled with hard work, patience, and the kind of love that isn't perfect but is real, flawed, and worth fighting for. The affair had been the darkest chapter of my life, but in some strange way, it had also forced Tom and me to confront the cracks in our relationship that we had been ignoring for so long. It had torn us apart, but it had also given us the chance to rebuild something stronger, something more honest. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once dreamed of. It was messy, complicated, and filled with pain, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. I had learned that love isn't always about the perfect moments. It's about the hard ones too. The moments where you have to choose to stay to fight for each other, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. And as Tom and I sat together on the porch of our home, watching the sunset, I realized that we were finally finding our way back to each other. Not as the people we used to be, but as the people we had become. Though Tom had forgiven me, the weight of what I had done didn't just vanish. Forgiveness was a beginning, not an ending, and as we tried to rebuild our marriage, the scars remained, invisible yet ever present. Some days were better than others. There were moments when I felt like things were returning to normal, like we were truly moving forward. But there were also moments when the past would creep up on us, threatening to tear open the wounds we had only just begun to heal. One such moment came one Saturday afternoon. It had been months since we'd had any major setbacks, and I had allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind us. We were hosting a small barbecue with a few friends in the backyard, a casual get-together to celebrate the warm summer weather. Tom and I worked together to prepare everything, exchanging light-hearted jokes and stolen glances that felt reminiscent of the early days of our relationship. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt easy again, like we had found our rhythm. The afternoon sun bathed the yard in a golden glow. Laughter filled the air. And for a while, I let myself believe that the past no longer mattered. Tom was chatting with one of his old friends, a beer in his hand, and I was standing with Rachel, who had been my rock through the darkest days. As we talked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from work or a casual update from a family member. But when I saw the name, my heart stopped. Dylan. The text was simple, just one word. Hi. I froze, the air around me suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy. For a moment I stood there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. Why was he messaging me now? After all this time, I had made it clear that I couldn't talk to him anymore. I had blocked his number months ago, but somehow there he was sneaking back into my life like a ghost from the past. Everything okay? Rachel asked, noticing the change in my expression. I quickly shoved my phone back into my pocket, forcing a smile. Yeah, just work, I lied. Nothing important. But it felt important. It felt like the walls I had so carefully rebuilt were starting to crack again. I tried to shake off the feeling, to focus on the barbecue, on Tom, on the life I had chosen. But Dylan's message lingered in the back of my mind, a dark shadow threatening to pull me back into a place I had fought so hard to leave behind. That night, after the guests had left and the house had settled into a comfortable silence, Tom and I curled up on the couch together. It was one of those quiet, peaceful moments that I had come to cherish, a reminder of how far we had come. But as I sat there with Tom's arm around me, my mind kept drifting back to the message on my phone, and I felt the familiar weight of guilt settle in my chest. I knew I should tell him. I had promised myself and Tom that I wouldn't keep any more secrets. But I was afraid. Afraid of how he might react. Afraid of reopening the wounds that were just starting to heal. I wasn't hiding anything, not really. I hadn't responded to Dylan's message, and I didn't intend to. But the fact that I hadn't immediately told Tom about it gnawed at me, like I was betraying him all over again just by keeping it to myself. Claire, you okay? Tom's voice broke through my thoughts, his eyes filled with concern. Yeah, I said quickly, too quickly. I'm fine. Just tired. He frowned, his thumb gently tracing circles on my shoulder. You've been quiet since everyone left. You sure everything's okay? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. This was it. The moment where I could either be honest and face the consequences, or keep the secret and hope it didn't come back to haunt me. My heart pounded as I wrestled with the decision. I got a text earlier, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom's brow furrowed. From who? I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. From Dylan. The air in the room shifted, the easy warmth between us evaporating in an instant. Tom's hand stilled on my shoulder, his entire body going rigid beside me. What did he say? Tom asked, his voice calm but tight, like he was trying to hold something back. Just, hi. I winced at how pathetic it sounded, how insignificant the message seemed compared to the impact it was clearly having on Tom. I didn't respond. I haven't talked to him since I ended it, I swear. Tom sat up, running a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. He was quiet for a long time, and I could see the internal battle he was fighting, the struggle to keep his emotions in check. Why now? He finally asked, his voice strained. Why is he reaching out now after all this time? I don't know, I said, feeling helpless. Maybe he just wanted to check in or... Check in? Tom snapped, his anger finally bubbling to the surface. Claire, you cheated on me with him. He doesn't get to just check in. I flinched at his words, the reminder of my betrayal hitting me like a slap in the face. I had tried so hard to move forward, to leave that part of my life behind, but it seemed like no matter what I did, it would always find a way to come back. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. I didn't ask him to text me. I don't want anything to do with him anymore. I want us. I've only ever wanted to fix this. Tom didn't respond right away. He stood up, pacing the room as if trying to work off the anger that was radiating from him in waves. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the same hurt I had seen so many times before, and it broke my heart all over again. Do you want to respond to him? Tom asked suddenly, his voice low, but there was an edge of vulnerability to it. No, I said firmly, standing up and walking over to him. I don't. I won't. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for any sign of doubt. I held his gaze, hoping he could see the sincerity in my words, the truth that I wasn't hiding anything from him anymore. I was done with Dylan, done with the life I had led with him, but I couldn't undo the damage I had caused, and that was what scared me the most, that no matter how much I tried, I would never be able to fully heal the wound I had inflicted on our marriage. I love you, Tom, I whispered, reaching for his hand. I know I've hurt you and I know it's going to take time, but I'm here. I'm not running away anymore. Tom's expression softened, but there was still a flicker of pain in his eyes. He squeezed my hand, his touch warm but hesitant. I want to believe you, he said quietly. I do. But every time something like this happens, it feels like we're right back where we started. I know, I whispered, tears slipping down my cheeks. But we're not. We've come so far and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We stood there, the distance between us both physical and emotional, yet still connected by the thread of our love, a thread that had been stretched thin but hadn't broken. Finally, Tom pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly against him. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, and for the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of hope. We'll get through this, Tom whispered, his voice soft but sure. We have to. After that night, I knew I had to take action to make sure Dylan was well and truly out of my life. The next morning, I changed my number. A small but significant step toward closing that chapter for good. I couldn't control whether Dylan tried to contact me again, but I could control my response. And I had made my choice. Tom was my future. Dylan was a part of my past that I needed to leave behind. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least our new version of normal. Tom and I continued to work on our relationship, building new habits of communication and trust. We both knew there were still scars, but we were learning how to live with them, how to move forward without letting the past define us. There were setbacks, of course. There were days when Tom's insecurities resurfaced, when he would ask questions about the affair, about Dylan, about why I had done what I had done. And there were days when I questioned whether we would ever truly be able to move past it. But each time we faced those moments together, refusing to let them tear us apart. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset like we used to in the early days of our marriage, Tom turned to me with a quiet smile. I'm glad we're still here, he said softly. Me too, I whispered, leaning my head against his shoulder. I'm really glad. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. We had made it through the storm, and though the road ahead wasn't perfect, it was ours. Together. Time passed, and slowly, the pain of the past began to fade into the background. It didn't disappear entirely. There were still moments when the memories of the affair would resurface, moments when Tom's trust would waver, when the shadow of what I had done would creep back into our lives. But those moments became fewer and farther between, and each time we handled them better than the last. Tom and I had come through the fire, and though we were both scarred, those scars became part of the fabric of our relationship. A reminder of what we had endured, but also of what we had overcome. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was stronger, more resilient. And in the end, that was what mattered. Months turned into a year, and gradually, Tom and I found ourselves in a place of quiet stability. The intensity of our early efforts to rebuild the marriage had softened into something more comfortable, something that felt like genuine healing. We started to trust again, to share moments of laughter and affection without the shadow of the affair constantly looming over us. But life, as I had learned, has a way of testing you just when you think you're finally safe. One Friday evening, Tom came home from work, looking more stressed than I had seen him in months. His usual warm greeting was absent, and instead of sitting with me for dinner, he disappeared into his home office. I let it slide at first, assuming he just had a tough day. But when the next few days followed the same pattern, Tom coming home late, barely speaking, retreating into himself, I started to worry. Something was wrong. It wasn't until a week later, when I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey in front of him, that he finally opened up. "Work's a mess right now," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "The company's going through a major restructuring, and there's talk of layoffs. I might be out of a job by the end of the month." I froze. The idea of Tom losing his job, the stability we had always counted on, sent a wave of anxiety crashing through me. We had just barely started to rebuild our life together, and now this? The thought of financial strain, of the uncertainty of what was coming, felt like a new challenge we weren't ready for. "We'll figure it out," I said quickly, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Whatever happens, we'll get through it." Tom nodded, but his expression was distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. It wasn't just the potential job loss that was weighing on him. It was the fear of failure. The pressure he put on himself to be the provider, to make sure everything was okay. That burden was heavy enough on a normal day, but now it was crushing him. Over the next few weeks, Tom's stress only intensified. Every day, he came home more exhausted, more withdrawn, and the distance between us that we had worked so hard to close began to grow again. I tried to be there for him, to offer support, but it felt like no matter what I said or did, it wasn't enough. He was shutting me out, and I didn't know how to pull him back in. One night, after a particularly long day, Tom came home and went straight to the bedroom without saying a word. I followed him, heart pounding, unsure of how to approach the growing tension between us. "Tom," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed as he changed out of his work clothes. "We need to talk." He sighed, clearly not in the mood for a conversation, but he sat down next to me, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "I know things are hard right now," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But we can't go back to where we were before. You're pulling away again, and I don't want us to lose what we've worked so hard to rebuild." Tom was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost defeated. "I don't know how to fix this, Claire," he admitted. "I feel like everything is slipping through my fingers, my job, our marriage. I'm trying, but I don't know if I'm enough." The raw vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. I had always seen Tom as the strong one, the steady one, the one who could hold everything together. But now, for the first time, he was admitting that he didn't know if he could. "You are enough," I said firmly, reaching for his hand. "You've always been enough, Tom. But you don't have to carry this burden alone. We're in this together." He looked at me then, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet intensity. "I don't want to lose you, Claire," he whispered. "Not again." "You won't," I promised, squeezing his hand. "We've come too far to let anything tear us apart now." The uncertainty of Tom's job situation loomed over us for the next few weeks. The company had announced that they were restructuring, but the layoffs hadn't been finalized yet, leaving Tom in a state of limbo. He was constantly on edge, and no matter how much I tried to reassure him that we'd get through it, the stress continued to build. Then one afternoon, Tom came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen when I heard the door open, and when I saw him standing there, his expression blank, I knew. It happened. he said quietly, dropping his briefcase by the door. "I'm out." My heart sank, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I walked over to him, wrapping my arms around him, and he collapsed into me, the weight of the situation finally breaking through the walls he had been trying to hold up. We spent the next few days in a state of shock. Tom had worked at the company for nearly a decade, and now suddenly it was all gone. The severance package wasn't enough to keep us afloat for long, and the reality of our financial situation was beginning to hit hard. We had savings, but they would only last for so long. The pressure to find a new job quickly was immense, and it was clear that Tom was struggling to cope with it. I tried to stay positive to keep things stable at home while Tom focused on job hunting, but the strain was starting to wear on both of us. There were moments when Tom's frustration boiled over. He would snap at me for no reason, or spend hours locked away in his office barely speaking. I knew he was trying to protect me from his stress, but in doing so, he was isolating himself again. One evening, after another day of job rejections and dead ends, Tom sat down at the dinner table, staring at his plate without touching his food. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he said quietly, his voice thick with frustration. "I feel like I'm failing at everything." "You're not failing," I said gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. "This is a tough situation, but you're doing everything you can." Tom shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I should have seen this coming. I should have planned better, saved more. I don't know how we're going to get through this." "We'll find a way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We always do." But the truth was I was scared too. I had always leaned on Tom for stability, and now with his job gone and the future uncertain, I wasn't sure how to handle the pressure either. We were both struggling, and it felt like we were drifting back into dangerous territory. The same territory that had led me into Dylan's arms in the first place. The difference now was that I knew what was at stake. I wasn't going to let the fear and stress push me away from Tom. This time I was going to fight for us no matter how hard things got. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of our lives. Tom threw himself into the job search with a desperation that was both admirable and heartbreaking. He applied for every position he could find, even ones that were far below his qualifications, but nothing seemed to stick. The rejection emails piled up, each one chipping away at his confidence. I did my best to support him to keep the household running smoothly, but the stress was starting to take its toll on me too. The constant worry about money, the tension between us, it was all becoming overwhelming. There were nights when I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if we were going to make it through this storm. Then one evening, after another long day of job hunting, Tom came home looking more defeated than I had ever seen him. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he said, dropping into the chair at the kitchen table. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes from the sleepless nights. "I feel like I'm just banging my head against a wall, and nothing's changing." I walked over to him, placing my hands on his shoulders. "We'll figure it out, Tom," I said softly. "You'll find something. I know you will." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know anymore, Claire. I'm trying so hard, but I feel like I'm losing myself." I knelt down beside him, looking up into his eyes. "You're not alone in this," I whispered. "We're a team. We'll get through it. Together." Tom looked at me, his expression softening for the first time in days. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said quietly, his voice filled with a kind of raw vulnerability that made my heart ache. "You don't have to do this without me," I said, squeezing his hand. "I'm right here." As the weeks dragged on, Tom and I began to settle into a strange rhythm. We both knew that the situation was precarious, but we were learning to navigate the uncertainty together. We had cut back on expenses, tightening our budget in ways we hadn't needed to before, and though it was stressful, it brought us closer in a way. There was something about facing a crisis together that made us rely on each other more than we had in a long time. But the stress was still there, hanging over us like a dark cloud. One evening, about 2 months after Tom lost his job, he came home with a new look in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in weeks. "Hope, I got a call today," he said as he walked into the kitchen, where I was preparing dinner. His voice was casual, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "An old colleague of mine reached out about a position. It's not exactly in my field, but it's something. And the pay's decent." My heart skipped a beat. This was the first real opportunity Tom had gotten in months, and I could see how much it meant to him to have even the possibility of a new job. I set the knife down and turned to face him, a smile spreading across my face. "That's amazing, Tom," I exclaimed, walking over to him. "Tell me everything." He smiled, the first real smile I had seen from him in what felt like forever. "It's with a smaller company, but they're looking for someone to manage their operations. It's not as high level as my last job, but I think it could be a good fit. The interview's next week." I wrapped my arms around him, feeling a surge of relief. This was what we had been waiting for, a glimmer of hope in what had felt like an endless storm. I could feel the weight lifting from Tom's shoulders, and for the first time in months, I let myself believe that maybe things were going to be okay. The days leading up to the interview were filled with nervous energy. Tom spent hours preparing, going over every detail, rehearsing answers to potential questions. I watched him with a mixture of pride and anxiety, hoping that this opportunity would be the break we needed. When the day of the interview finally arrived, I could tell Tom was both excited and nervous. He kissed me goodbye that morning, dressed in his best suit, and as he walked out the door, I whispered a silent prayer that this would be the chance we had been waiting for. The hours ticked by slowly that day. I couldn't focus on work, my mind constantly drifting back to Tom, wondering how the interview was going. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a message or a call from him, but it wasn't until late afternoon that I finally heard the familiar buzz of my phone. "Tom, just finished. Went well. I'll tell you everything when I get home." My heart leapt, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I couldn't wait to hear how it had gone. That evening, Tom walked through the door with a smile on his face that made my heart soar. "It went great," he said, pulling me into his arms as soon as he stepped inside. "They seemed really interested, and I think I made a good impression. I should hear back in a few days." I hugged him tightly, my emotions threatening to spill over. After months of watching Tom struggle, seeing him like this, confident, hopeful, was everything I had been waiting for. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Tom kissed the top of my head, his arms wrapped around me in a way that felt protective, reassuring. "Thank you," he murmured. "I couldn't have gotten through this without you." The next few days were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Tom and I both tried to stay busy, distracting ourselves from the waiting, but every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat. We didn't talk about it much. We both knew that getting our hopes up too high could lead to disappointment, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Then one afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk, my phone buzzed. It was Tom. I picked it up, my heart racing, and before I could say anything, I heard the excitement in his voice. "I got it," he exclaimed, his voice filled with joy. "Claire, I got the job." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, a mixture of relief and happiness flooding through me. Tears sprang to my eyes as I laughed, overwhelmed by the emotions I had been bottling up for so long. "That's amazing, Tom," I said, my voice shaking with excitement. "I'm so happy for you." "Me too," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. We did it. With Tom's new job came a renewed sense of stability, both financially and emotionally. The weight that had been pressing down on us for months began to lift, and though the challenges weren't over, there was a sense that we were finally moving forward again. Tom threw himself into his new role, determined to make the most of the opportunity. The job was different from his previous one, more hands-on and less corporate, but in many ways it suited him better. He came home each day looking more energized, more like the man I had fallen in love with, and seeing him like that filled me with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Our relationship, too, began to heal in ways I hadn't expected. The crisis of Tom's unemployment had forced us to rely on each other in ways we hadn't before, and that reliance had deepened our bond. We had been through the fire, and though we still bore the scars, we had come out stronger on the other side. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past would resurface in ways we hadn't anticipated. Tom had forgiven me for the affair, but I knew that the memory of it still lingered in the background, a reminder of how fragile trust could be. There were days when he would ask out of the blue if I had heard from Dylan again, or if I ever thought about him. Each time I reassured him that Dylan was firmly in the past, that I had no desire to revisit that chapter of my life. And it was the truth. But even as we moved forward, I couldn't deny that the affair had changed us. It had reshaped the way we looked at each other, the way we approached our relationship. There was a newfound honesty between us, a willingness to confront the difficult conversations instead of letting them fester in silence. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Tom turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to forgive someone until now." I looked at him, surprised by the sudden seriousness in his tone. "What do you mean?" Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I thought forgiveness was just about letting go of the anger, moving past the hurt. But it's more than that. It's about rebuilding trust, about learning to love each other in a different way, after everything has been broken." I nodded, my throat tightening with emotion. "It hasn't been easy," I admitted. "But we're still here." "Yeah," Tom said, a small smile playing on his lips. "We are." He reached over, taking my hand in his, and for a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly fading as the future stretched out before us. We had been through the worst of it, and somehow we had found our way back to each other. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The months that followed were a time of growth, both for Tom and me as individuals and for our marriage. We had learned how to communicate better, how to be more open with each other, and how to handle the difficult moments without letting them tear us apart. It wasn't always perfect, but it was progress. Tom flourished in his new job, and I could see how much happier he was in this new role. He wasn't just working to pay the bills anymore. He was passionate about what he was doing, and that passion translated into every aspect of our life together. He was more present, more engaged, and our relationship benefited from it in ways I hadn't anticipated. We took more time for each other, too. Date nights became a regular thing again, and we made an effort to do the little things that had once made our relationship so strong, things we had neglected in the years before everything fell apart. One night, as we sat together on the couch after a long day, Tom turned to me with a soft smile. "I'm glad we didn't give up," he said quietly. "Me too," I whispered, resting my head on his shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that we were truly going to be okay. As time went on, the scars of the past began to fade, replaced by the strength we had found in each other. We weren't perfect, and our relationship wasn't without its challenges, but we had learned how to weather the storms together. Looking back on everything we had been through, the affair, the job loss, the moments of doubt and fear, I realized that those experiences had shaped us in ways we couldn't have imagined. They had forced us to confront our vulnerabilities, our flaws, and our deepest fears, but they had also shown us how resilient we were. Tom and I had chosen each other again and again, even when it was hard. And that choice, more than anything, was what had kept us strong. The future wasn't certain, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it would take us. As more time passed, life began to feel normal again. A new kind of normal perhaps, but one that felt right for Tom and me. The weight of the past no longer hung over us like a dark cloud. Instead, it became part of the story that shaped who we were. The affair, the job loss, the fear of losing each other. It all seemed like distant echoes now, faint reminders of where we had been and how far we had come. There was one evening, several months after Tom had settled into his new job, that really marked the turning point for me. We were sitting on our porch as we often did, the air warm with the last hint of summer. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed everything in shades of gold, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Tom reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. There was a quiet contentment between us now, a calmness that had taken root after all the chaos we had endured. We didn't need to say much anymore. We just understood each other in a way we hadn't before. Maybe because we had learned how fragile everything could be. "You know," Tom said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." I turned to him, curious. "What do you mean?" He smiled, that same easy smile I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I mean everything we've been through. I used to wonder if we'd ever get back to what we were before. But now, I don't think I want to go back to that. I think what we have now is stronger, more real." His words settled over me like a warm blanket. I had wondered the same thing for so long, whether we would ever return to the way things used to be. But he was right, we didn't need to. We had built something new, something better. A love that had been tested and had come out the other side stronger for the struggles. I think so too, I whispered, squeezing his hand. It wasn't easy, but I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. Tom's eyes softened as he looked at me, and I could see the truth of his words reflected in his gaze. I wouldn't either, he said quietly. We sat there for a while longer, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in vibrant shades of pink and orange. And in that moment I realized that I was no longer haunted by the guilt, the fear, or the uncertainty that had once consumed me. I had forgiven myself just as Tom had forgiven me. We had both learned how to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it might hold. There were no more secrets between us. No more lies, no more hiding. For the first time in years I felt free. The years that followed were full of new challenges, as life always is, but Tom and I faced them together. We built a life we were proud of, one that was grounded in the lessons we had learned during our hardest moments. Our love wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was strong. And that strength carried us through the ups and downs, the everyday struggles, and the unexpected surprises that life threw our way. Looking back on everything we had been through, I realized that our story wasn't just one of betrayal and forgiveness. It was a story of growth, of rediscovery, of finding love again after everything had seemed lost. And most importantly, it was a story of two people who refused to give up on each other, no matter how hard things got. We had faced the darkness together, and we had come out on the other side. And for that I was forever grateful.